Good morning.
Morning.
It's good to see a big crowd. Yeah, I guess it's afternoon. I have to remember the time we're at. It is a pleasure to be out today. It's great. Actually, we've had a number of bill signings throughout the week, and this one's obviously kind of special, not only because we got a great group here, but it was just about a decade ago that I first introduced a photo ID requirement. It was very similar to what we're passing today, and I want to thank particularly Representative Jeff Stone and Senator Joe Leibham for their leadership on this. Obviously, a whole bunch of other co-sponsors and folks that voted in the Assembly and the Senate, not only Republicans, but one independent and a number of Democrats that voted for this measure. And I think it's important because when we think about this, the integrity of each and every vote cast here in the state of Wisconsin is imperative. And some people would question, the impact. To me, something as important as a vote is important in whether it's one case, 100 cases, or 100,000 cases, making sure we have legislation that protects the integrity for an open, fair, and honest election in every single case is important, protecting in that case alone. When I've talked to individual voters from across the state who've raised concerns about this, they've said more than anything, it's what they care about in terms of their own personal vote that makes a difference here, to make sure that the vote that they cast is one that counts just as much as anybody else's out there, and that every other vote cast here in the state of Wisconsin is cast fairly and under a legal process, and that's one more step towards making that possible and what we're going to be signing in law today. Now, it's interesting when you think about in the past decade the evolution of all the work that was put in this. I think about how simple it was when I asked back a decade ago. I was looking for essentially a driver's license or a state-issued ID card. The legislation I'm going to sign in law in a moment allows for plenty of other venues. It applies for legitimate exemptions, for example, for people who are living in residential care facilities such as a nursing home and places like that. It accounts for all those issues out there. I think the facts are pretty clear, and I asked this week from both the Department of Transportation and from the Government Accountability Board, I asked for two numbers to just put this in perspective. For any complaint you might hear about this, keep this in mind. As of right now, there are just under 4.5 million state-issued driver's licenses or state-issued ID cards. 4.5 million. You know how many registered voters there are in the state of Wisconsin? Just under 3.5 million. So there are essentially approximately a million more state-issued driver's licenses or ID cards already in the state of Wisconsin. So if anyone questions how this is going to be possible, the simple reality is there are literally close to 1 million more of the IDs out in just that first category, the category I asked for in the legislation a decade ago, and obviously there are plenty more examples, whether it's on our college campuses, whether it's our military personnel or others on our tribal governments. All of those IDs are included here as well as part of this legislation. And I'm pleased to say that. And as we speak, in the coming days, and it was already talked about earlier this week, the Joint Finance Committee is moving forward with the funding to ensure that this legislation is able to go forward and be fully implemented. And it's something that I'm proud to sign into law. So I'm pleased to be here today. One other just quick comment while we're talking about actions that the legislature is a part of and is pending in the coming days. Many of the folks standing here as well will be voting on this hopefully in the coming week or so. But we saw legislation introduced this week, the bill to pay the bills, as you call it. Talking about the budget, it's important to be mindful of that as well. We're supportive of the legislature moving forward and taking action to pay our bills here. I point out for some time that like families all across the state, you get a point where the credit card bill is running up too big. It's time to cut up the credit card and ultimately pay those bills. And after years and years and years of state government running up the credit card bill, we're doing with the revenue that was brought in because of good, healthy revenue projections that came out recently is making sure we're paying off the bills that are past due and the bills that are pending so that it puts us in a better position, not just for this budget, but for coming budgets, to make sure we make a true commitment to the future so that our children and our grandchildren don't face the kind of dire consequences many of us here and across the country have been facing this year as well. So that's just an aside as we talk about it, but it's my thrill here today. The last thing I just want to do is not only to thank, as I mentioned, our two key lead sponsors, all the other co-sponsors who are here, lawmakers who voted for this measure, but many of the people in this room and many other people across the state have for years been standing up and saying we need to have fair, open, and honest elections in this state. And while there are a variety of things that have been done and more things that need to be done in the future to continue to ensure that we have fair, open, and honest elections, one of the most obvious and one of the most sought-after things, and one of the things that really the public, in nearly every poll I've seen, it's not just been Republicans, but Republicans, Independents, and Democrats alike have repeatedly said that requiring a photo identification to vote was a common sense solution. It's something that we do in just about everywhere else in life. As simple as things like getting cold medicine requires a photo ID, checking out a library book in many of our public libraries, doing just about everything else in life requires that. Doesn't it make sense for something that's much more important than cold medicine or a library book, but in protecting the integrity of each and every vote cast in the state, certainly is worthy of a simple requirement that we show photo identification as defined under this bill, which will soon be the law. So it's my honor to sign it in the law. After we do that, I'll take some questions on this or other topics at the tail end. Actually, there's a couple kids out there. I always get asked at these, why do you have so many pens? It's because there's a lot of people back here that want to copy. A lot of other people would like a pen as well for this. I'll have to go back in my bill file and see if there's any other bills from a decade ago that one of you guys want to bring up. And
I went through your desk.
That's right. I had to laugh the other day when people talked about a rush. I said, well, in this case, it took about a decade. So there are some things that don't move as quick as you'd like throughout the legislative process. Certainly, this was one that took a lot longer than I think many people expected, but it was certainly worth the wait. We appreciate all of you here and all the others who've not only voted for this but supported it. With that, I'll take questions if you got them.
Are you prepared to sign any concealed carry legislation that Congress will support of GOP lawmakers and pass this legislature?
Well, in the past, I've repeatedly said throughout the campaign I'm a supporter of a right to carry in the state of Wisconsin. I've supported the legislation that Governor Doyle in the past vetoed repeatedly. Whether it's that or something similar to that, I'd be happy to have that cross my desk. I'd like us to be not the last state remaining. I'd like us, as usual, to be ahead of Illinois. In this case, Illinois is the last remaining state that doesn't have some sort of concealed carry. And all the other states that have it have yet to repeal it because I think it's worked effectively in those states. But what goes through the process, as lawmakers know, there's a lot of different options that may be coming before us. I reserve the right to look at that until I see what's been presented to us.
We ran a story last night that showed that the DOT was spending about $13.8 million more in the contracts executed at the beginning of this year. Do you believe something should happen in this budget to put more staff in the Department of Transportation to save taxpayers' money?
We'll be looking not necessarily just in the budget process, but we've got the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commission that I appointed early on in January, who's been looking at this and a series of other issues in other state agencies, corrections, and others down the line, but really across the board, to see what's the most effective use. When I was a county executive, in many cases, I contracted out for services where they were cost effective and was very eager to do that. But I've also criticized my predecessor and others when they did it in areas where it actually cost the state more. We've challenged the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commission to look in these areas, as well as DOT and corrections in particular, to look at that. It won't be something that will be included specifically, to my knowledge, in amendments between now and the end of June that will be in the budget, but certainly it's things we look to change if we can prove that it's more cost effective doing it within the department.
The Secretary said yesterday that he didn't know if they would be able to address it until the next budget cycle, but given that there's obviously a lot more money being spent, is there something that can be done in the immediate to address it?
If there are savings, there's no doubt about it. We're going to look at ways, and we'll work with the legislature, again, not only in transportation, but in corrections and other areas. If we can do it effectively in-house, we'll do it, or we'll confirm if there are other ways to save monies alternatively. In some ways, it may not just be a question of whether it's in-house or not. It may be a question of whether or not those areas where it is being contracted out for, whether or not they're holding contractors accountable in terms of producing savings there as well. So ultimately, our bottom line is we want to make sure the taxpayers get the best bang for the buck. We want both quality, and we want it at the most cost-effective basis possible. So if we can combine those two, we're going to figure out a way to get it done.
Would you like to see the legislature pass redistricting before the recalls?
Timing-wise, I just want a good, fair, decent plan. I was here a decade ago when we acted on that. I mean, to me, the premise is not so much the timing. I think you want to have a fair map. You want a map that maintains communities of interest, so you're not splitting up different communities of interest in different parts of the state, but keeping them intact, or as much intact as it can be done in a new map, knowing that there'll have to be some changes because of the census, making sure that we protect the rights of minority voters in the state, which has always been important as part of the redistricting process and something I was actively involved in a decade ago. If we can meet all that criteria, whether it's earlier this summer or whether it's sometime next fall, to me the outcome is more important than the timing. Sure.
Governor, I think this is bad legislation today, and it's been that way since January. At least half the people in the state of Wisconsin don't agree with this policy or other policies like it. Like I said, it's been that way since January. When are you going to start listening to the other half of the people who have good, valid points? I sat through the Assembly hearings, the Senate hearings on this bill. Not one Republican saw any good in those amendments that were offered. 29 in the Senate, 50 in the Assembly, and they thought there was not one good idea. They didn't even listen. I witnessed it myself.
Well, again, it's one thing. It's great to have people come in and testify, but when more than 80% of the public says they support photo ID, this is a prime example of listening to the public, not just to Republicans, but clearly Democrats as well as Republicans said they wanted this legislation. That's why we're signing. Well, in every survey out there, it showed that by Democrat, Republican pollsters again.
Concealed carry, in principle, do you think there should be some training component included in any bill that passes? Do you think we should allow, in essence, to buy a gun, walk out the street and carry concealed, the constitutional carry option they talked about?
Well, in the past, when this legislation is passed, the right to carry is passed in the state legislature, passed overwhelmingly with votes from Democrats and Republicans alike. In fact, it was one vote away from being overwritten by Governor Doyle's veto, and had that particular member not switched his vote, it would currently be the law here in the state of Wisconsin. I've said repeatedly I'd support that legislation. As you know, that legislation included both a permit and training requirement in it. I'd be happy to sign that if that came before my desk, and we'll look at whatever other options may be before us between now and the end of the legislative session.
Time for maybe one more.
Governor, do you believe that this photo ID legislation will withstand any constitutional challenge it might face?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about it. It has in other states for years. In fact, in other states that have enacted a photo ID requirement, in many cases the voting numbers have stayed the same or increased. So there's no doubt about it. When you have nearly 1 million more people in this state who have a state-issued ID card or a driver's license than you have registered voters, there is no excuse. We need it for public assistance. We need it for just about everything else in life. This is a logical requirement. It's why the overwhelming majority of the people in this state, no matter what political party they're a part of, support this legislation, and why I'm proud to sign it into law today. Thanks very much for your time.